Hello, and welcome back to another episode of Molla the Scholar. So let's get straight into it. So today I bring you 7 disturbing human experiments. This video is not for the squeamish, so watch it at your own discretion. These experiments all included people who were subjected to dehumanizing trials, tests, and tribulations, all in the name of advancing psychology, science, sociology, even warfare, and much more. At number 7, we have the Agent Orange experiment. So throughout history, and possibly in the present, prisoners and minority groups such as Black, Asian, and Indigenous people have always been forced to be subjects of horrendous studies. So between 1965 and 1966, Dr. Albert Kligman, funded by Dow Chemical, Johnson & Johnson, and the US Army, conducted what we could call a dermatological study on about 75 prisoners. But what was really being studied? The effects of Agent Orange on human beings. Agent Orange is a herbicide and defoliant which has detrimental effects to the environment and also contains traces of dioxin, which has very bad side effects to an individual's health when they are exposed to it, such as disabilities, future generations, and on top of that also cancers and in some cases death. So the prisoners in this experiment were injected with 468 times the amount of Agent Orange that was originally stated by the research. The results on the human body? Catastrophic. There were volcanic eruptions of chloracne, which is severe acne combined with cysts, blackheads, pustules, and much more. And these were coming from the prisoners' faces, groin areas, and armpits. Unfortunately, the prisoners continued experiencing the side effects of this experiment long after the experiment had actually been terminated. Dr. Kligman was quoted as very excitedly saying, "All I saw before me were acres of skin. It was like a farmer seeing fertile land for the first time. Any repercussions? No." Dr. Kligman later became the genius behind the famous acne treatment Retin A. At number 6, we have the irradiation of Black cancer patients. So the Cold War era definitely fueled a lot of unethical experiments, with the Soviet Union and the US constantly trying to one-up each other in the scientific realm. So sometimes the experiments did get very out of hand. So in this particular case, they wanted to know, would either party be able to survive a nuclear war? How much radiation could the human body actually take? And how do they find this out in order to potentially save their soldiers from a potential atomic atrocity? Cue the usual and unknowing and unwilling subjects, African Americans. So between 1960 and 1971, a radiologist at the University of Cincinnati exposed 88 cancer patients to full body radiation. However, this type of full body radiation had already been discredited for the types of cancer that these patients had. Participants were being tricked by being told that they were getting a type of treatment which could really help them. They were then exposed to the equivalent of 20,000 X-rays worth of radiation in 1 hour. The results? Nausea and vomiting, severe stomach pains, loss of appetite, as well as mental confusion. A report in 1972 actually showed that around 25% of the patients had died from radiation poisoning. The radiologist in charge, Dr. Sanger, has since received a gold award for his efforts and achievement in the field by the Radiological Society of America. At number 5, we have the Tuskagee Experiments. Some African Americans are very skeptical of the country's medical institution, and even now, many accept the conspiracy theory that AIDS was created by the government in order to ravage and just destroy many Black communities. And this is very fair and within good reason. The Tuskagee, Alabama experiments in 1932 form a very strong basis for this distrust of the government and the medical institutions. During this time period, treatments for syphilis, which is an STD that can cause immense pain, insanity, and death, were highly dangerous and very ineffective. They mostly consisted of ingesting mercury, which is very toxic and poisonous to human beings. So government-funded doctors wanted to experiment and find out if no treatment would be better than the current treatment in order to see what would be more effective in dealing with syphilis. And so for the next 40 years, the Tuskagee study of untreated syphilis in the male denied any form of treatment to 399 syphilitic black patients. Most of them were poor, illiterate sharecroppers. What's worse is that even after penicillin was discovered as a very effective treatment in 1947, the patients were still denied treatment, or in some cases were given placebo treatments instead. Some patients were also told that they were not suffering from syphilis, but rather they were suffering from a bad blood condition. By the time the study had ended in 1972, only 74, so 18% of the patients, had survived. 28 died directly as a result of the syphilis. 100 died from syphilitic complications, and 40 of the patients' wives had also contracted the disease, and 19 of the children were born with congenital syphilis. At number 4, we have the infamous case of David Reimer, a young boy who at 7 months old had his destroyed accidentally during a botched circumcision. John Money, a psychologist and an avant-garde proponent of the idea of gender neutrality, later convinced Reimer's parents to go ahead and raise him as a girl because they had some fears about what would happen to a young boy growing up in a society without his male organ and how that would impact him and his life. So he and his team convinced the parents that raising David Reimer as a girl, as Brenda Reimer, would actually be more beneficial for him because he would be able to have a very successful and fruitful life. And so when David Reimer became 22 months old, they then did a gender reassignment surgery on him. And this was followed up by a lot of psychological consultations where they would see how the parents were socializing the young Brenda Reimer to be a young girl. Later in his life, Reimer recounted that Money would often, during the psychological consultations, force the twins to commit certain acts in order for Money to see if Brenda at the time was being socialized to be stereotypically feminine in those certain acts. During his adolescence, David, or at the time Brenda, was also injected with amounts of estrogen to ensure that he would develop as a young lady. However, he never identified as a girl, and he always felt that he was really a boy at heart. According to Reimer and his experiences, he stated that being given the female hormones and being raised as a girl did not make him feel any more like a girl. However, in all of the findings, the psychologist Money only reported success. Reimer also recounted being seriously teased, ostracized, and severely depressed during his childhood. He was only told the truth about his biological sex at birth when he was 14 years old. And once he found out, he decided to then revert to the sex he had at birth. This was not easy, and after many years of possible disrupted identity, gender dysmorphia, bullying, being ostracized, and probably a sense of not belonging, Reimer took his life at age 38 years old. This case is notorious as it led to Money's view on the malleability of gender really being or becoming a dominant viewpoint within a lot of medical fields, and reassuring them that sexual reassignment in some cases for young kids was very effective and would be the best thing in cases of botched circumcisions. This resulted in thousands of gender reassignment surgery, many of which were done in infancy and of course without the child's consent. It really makes me question the nature versus nurture argument in constructs that form our identity, such as gender, sex, and the complex interplay between the two. It also begs the question of a child's rights to give consent on non-life-threatening yet life-changing procedures. At number 3, we have the US, the Nazis, and Japan's Unit 731. So we always learn about the Second World War when we are in school. We learn about the horrible Nazis and the very heroic Western Alliance who saved us from an era of potentially speaking German. What we were often shielded from, however, was the true reality of the evil experimentation going on behind the scenes of shrapnel and fascism. World War II was definitely the heyday of evil experimentation. For example, in the US, you had the Tuskagee Experiments, aforementioned. So notably, the Germans conducted their experiments on Jewish people, Romani people, Polish people, homosexuals, and many others in their death or concentration camps. Not commonly known, however, is that the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, would also submerge naked prisoners in icy cold waters for very long periods of time in order to study the effects of cold on the human body. They would then try to come up with ways to warm or rewarm the humans afterwards. These people were all living, by the way. Other prisoners were also subjected to bad bacteria, deadly diseases, and ghastly gases on purpose. Blood vessels were purposely tied off in order to create or recreate artificial battle wounds. Glass and wood shavings were then rubbed into these wounds in order to aggravate them. The aim of all this? To test out if an antibacterial that they had created would be able to be effective enough in such situations. Women were sterilized against their will. Men were also sterilized against their will. One woman even had her breasts tied off with string in order to see how long it would take for her nursing baby to die. Not wanting to see her baby suffer, she later killed her own baby to spare it from the pain of starvation. And of course, there was the infamous Joseph Mengele, who actually liked experimenting on twins. And he did a couple of really messed up things too. For example, he would inject chemicals into twins to see the effects of these. And in some cases, he even sewed the twins together in order to create his own version of conjoined twins. He never answered for his crimes after the war, however, having fled to South America and lived out the rest of his days until his death. The Japanese were bad too, but some of their experiments, especially in their Unit 731, led by Commander Shiro Ishii, could honestly put the Nazis to shame. It is suggested that the Japanese killed up to 200,000 innocent civilians in the name of scientific experiments in both World War II and the Sino-Japanese War. Most of these tests were done on Chinese civilians. People were cut open alive, they had body limbs chopped off and sewn onto other body parts. All of this was done without the aid of anesthesia. Not that anesthesia would make any of this okay anyway. Limbs were then frozen and then thawed or defrosted in order to create gangrene. Subjects had grenades and flamethrowers thrown at them in order to see if they would be able to survive the impact. They had different strains of deadly viruses and bacteria injected in them just to see the effects of these on human beings. Across Chinese cities, wells of water were infected with typhoid, cholera, and they even released plague-carrying fleas into large towns. According to a Times report, former members of the Unit 731 have also told media outlets that some subjects were given poisonous gases and others were put into pressure chambers and left there until their eyes popped out of their sockets. So Unit 731 conducted this research and these experiments in the name of biological and chemical warfare. And you would think that those who committed such atrocities were then held accountable for their crimes, at least in the war tribunals that took place after the World War II, right? Nope. Just before Japan surrendered in 1945, Unit 731 was destroyed, all of the evidence was burned, and the remaining prisoners and subjects were executed. Ishii was never prosecuted for his crimes, and rather, he was granted immunity in exchange for the information that he had found out during his experiments. This cover-up was apparently part of a US plan in order to keep Japan as an ally during the Cold War. At number 2, we have 3 identical strangers. The following study is also really heavily linked to experiments of nature versus nurture and starts off like something out of a movie, to be honest. Yes, I have named this particular study after the very infamous Netflix documentary 3 Identical Strangers, which I recommend you watch. There will be a few spoilers coming up, so if you haven't yet watched it, you can just fast forward to number 1 if that's what you really want to find out. Okay, in the name of science, psychologists led by Peter Neubauer, an Austrian-born Jew who had escaped the Nazi regime, conducted a secret experiment in which they separated multiple sets of twins and triplets and adopted them out as singlets or single children during the 60s and the 70s. For this video, I will focus on the case of the triplets, David Kellman, Robert Shafran, and Edward Gallen. It gets worse. The psychologists purposefully put these children up for adoption in families that had 3 different socioeconomic backgrounds: fairly rich, well off, and slightly poorer. The psychologists ensured that the families who adopted the children were living around the same area within the same state, so there was always that possibility that the kids could have actually bumped into each other. It gets worse. They had never told the adoptive parents that the child they were adopting was indeed a triplet. The triplets' mother, their birth mother, had experienced bouts of mental ill health during her teens or her younger years, and interestingly enough, each of these triplets in their separate environments also experienced bouts of mental ill health when they were growing up. The experiment only came to light when the 3 children, or the triplets, who at the time were strangers to each other, accidentally came across each other or found each other again in their late teens/early 20s. Understandably, the families and the triplets themselves were beyond angry. Later on in 1995, one of the triplets later committed suicide after a long bout of mental ill health. The psychologists who headed the study showed no remorse for what they had done, and instead went as far as saying that they thought that they had done a good thing for the children by allowing them to develop individual identities separate from each other. These revelations led to ethical comparisons of Nazi twin experiments from the same regime that Peter Neubauer himself had once escaped. And the worst part? None of the participants are able to access any of the findings of this experiment until 2066. This is because Peter Neubauer has actually before he had died, he had locked all of these findings away in an archive in Yale University, which will only be accessible in 2066, and no one can actually access it before then. Last I heard, some of these subjects themselves have been able to start gaining access to some of the information. However, these are heavily redacted and do not make as much sense as they should. My number 1 most disturbing human experiment is the gynaecological experimentation on African American slaves. This particular experiment makes me really, really, really uncomfortable because as a Black woman, I do not understand to this day how common and how normal it all was. And it is emotionally distressing, so please do take a break here if you need to. So these experiments were conducted by J. Marion Sims. So the use of enslaved people for medical research in the antebellum South was very, very common at the time and was not actually unheard of. And so without any repercussions, Sims was able to create a hospital for the slaves that he had bought, rented, or owned. Officially, it was to treat them from any kinds of illnesses or ailments that may have befallen on them. However, we later found out that it was also to do experiments on them in order to advance his own medical agenda. This hospital has actually been referred to as the first women's hospital in history. So in 1845, he was brought a slave woman who had some kind of condition that was unknown to him, a vesico-vaginal fistula. Now these were not fatal, but they were a common, socially destructive, and catastrophic complication of childbirth, which affected many women at the time. There was definitely no effective treatment or cure for this. And of course, lacking any kind of adequate birth control, the birth rates at the time were a lot higher, and therefore women were more prone to having this complication during childbirth. In addition to this, in the mid-19th century, the field of gynecology was not very well developed, as doctors, who were predominantly all male at the time, found it absolutely disgusting to examine female organs. Sims himself only became interested in this when a slave owner brought in one of the slaves that he owned, and she had this condition. Sims examined her by observing her organ and was later inspired to develop a treatment for this. He then developed what we now know as a speculum. From 1845 to 1849, he started experimenting on more and more enslaved black women. He made a second hospital in order to increase space for his non-consenting subjects. He used other painful sounding instruments on them and always operated or did his experiments without the use of anesthesia. This was also because of the notion perpetuated at the time that black people do not experience as much pain as white people. This notion was common both in society as well as in the medical field. Sims eventually started purchasing so many black enslaved women in order to experiment on them that even his assistants grew tired of this. And he started having to ask the patients themselves to assist him whilst he was experimenting on them without their consent. One of his patients nearly died from sepsis because he operated on her without using anesthesia, and he just used the practice of a medical sponge in order to wipe away body fluids that were leaking from her. And he then left the sponge inside of her urethra in the presence of 12 other doctors. Critics often say that Sims cared more about the experiments than about finding therapeutic treatments for these women, and that he caused untold suffering, both physical and psychological, to the black enslaved women by operating under that racist medical notion that black people do not feel as much pain as white people. His use of enslaved black living bodies as experimental subjects is definitely not the first, and unfortunately not the last in a long history of medical apartheid that includes other cases such as Henrietta Lacks in the mid-20th century, and even the Tuskagee syphilis experiments in the early to late 20th century. And of course there were much more that haven't been mentioned in this video. Perhaps his ideology, which was commonly accepted during that era, contributes to the current differences, negligence and disproportional fatalities or near fatalities experienced by black women in the medical field today. Whether it's the racial microaggressions of not being believed when in pain to higher mortality rates when you're giving birth in some Western countries. This of course is my opinion, and I've formulated this based on the research that I have done and also what I have read out there. I strongly urge you to also do the same and research and find out more about this and form your own opinions too. I will also leave some recommended articles as per usual at the end of this video. So that's all from me and my odd number of very disturbing human experiments done in the name of the sciences and sometimes in the name of racism or fascism. If you disagree with my list, which some of you may, please do let me know in the comments below which one you would put as number 1. If also you would like a part 2 of this video, again, let me know in the comments below. And if you have other studies that you would like for me to delve into in a separate video, again, let me know in the comments below. As always, like, subscribe, share, and follow me on my social media accounts too, which will be at the end of this video. Also, honorary shout out to the studies that didn't make this video but are also very sick. I might do a part 2. Depends on the response. Okay, bye!